Okay, today we're going to talk about binomial multiplication. We're going to start out with a very short review of monomial multiplication and monomial distribution. So you've already seen a couple examples like example 1 and example 2. Example 1 is 2x cubed times 3x squared. Example 2 is negative 3y squared times the quantity 2y minus 1. You've already seen these examples when we did exponent rules. So here when I multiply a monomial times a monomial, I'll get 2 times 3 and x cubed times x squared. 2 times 3 is 6. X cubed times x squared, when written out like this, we've already learned with the exponent rules that you'll add those exponents and you'll get x to the 5th power. Over here on this one, this is just distribution. You guys are pretty comfortable with distribution. So I'll multiply negative 3y squared times 2y and negative 3y squared times negative 1. Negative 3 times a positive 2 is a negative 6. Y squared times y. Now you need to remember that if it's just a variable that it has a power of 1. So I'm multiplying like I did here. I'll add the exponents and get y to the 3rd power. Then I have negative 3 times a negative 1. Well, that becomes a positive 3. And then y squared times, well, there's no y over here. So the y squared is just going to carry to my answer. And that's how you distribute a monomial. But today, the important thing that we're going to do today is binomial multiplication. What that means is I'm going to have a binomial times a binomial. For instance, 2x squared minus 1 times 3x squared plus 1. That's a good example. Another example of binomial multiplication would be if they wrote it in the form x, say, minus 2 squared. What this really means is that I have x minus 2 times x minus 2. So anytime you have a binomial raised to a power of 2, what they really want is that binomial times itself. Okay? Now, we'll go ahead and start with this one because it's a little bit more simple, and we'll come back to this harder one. X minus 2 times x minus 2 says I have to multiply this first number times both of these numbers and then this second number times both of these numbers. There are two ways I can show you to do this. I'm going to start by showing you with arrows, and then I'll go back and I'll show you another way where we break it up into separate pieces, okay? Or actually backwards. We're going to break it up first, then I'll show you with the arrows. So to start, I'm going to break it up into two separate pieces. Since I know I have to multiply x times x minus 2 and negative 2 times x minus 2, I'm going to show that like this. X times x minus 2 minus 2 times x minus 2. So all I did is I took this first binomial and I split it into two different places. Okay? Then next to that I wrote the entire second binomial. So I have x times the binomial and negative 2 times the binomial. Now all I have to do is distribute. I can distribute x times x and x times negative 2. Well, x times x is x squared, and x times negative 2 is negative 2x. Then over here I can distribute negative 2 times x and negative 2 times negative 2. Well, negative 2 times x is a negative 2x, and negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. Then I notice that right here in the middle I have like terms. Well, I'm going to go ahead and combine those. I'll have x squared minus 4x plus 4. And then I cannot combine anything else, so this one is done. This is actually what we call a perfect square trinomial. And we'll talk about taking it from a perfect square like this to a binomial like this. And we'll do that in the future. Now, another way that I could have done this is with just arrows. I could have written x minus 2 times x minus 2. And I could have just drawn arrows to show this multiplication here. So x times x is x squared. x times negative 2 is negative 2x. Then negative 2 times x is negative 2x. And negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. Then I would again have noticed that I have like terms in the middle, and I would have written that as x squared minus 4x plus 4. So those are the two different ways that you can solve it. This is the way that we are going to require on the very first test. This is required, okay, where you split it out. You break it into two separate pieces, then you distribute and combine like terms. This is the way that after that test, you'll be able to do it a little bit faster. You'll learn the tricks, okay? So I'm going to come back over to this one, example 3, which is a little bit harder than this one. And I'm going to do the same thing I did here. I'm going to take this first binomial and I'm going to split it into 2. 2x squared minus 1. And then next to each of those pieces, I'm going to write the entire second binomial. 3x squared plus 1, 3x squared plus 1. Then now all I have to do at this point is distribute. 2x squared times 3x squared. Well, 2 times 3 is 6. X squared times x squared is x to the 4th. Then I have 2x squared times a positive 1. Well, 1 times anything is itself, so I'm going to say that's a positive 2x squared. Then I have negative 1 times 3x squared. Well, that's negative 3x squared because all it did was change my sign. And then I have negative 1 times a positive 1. Well, negative 1 times a positive 1 is a negative 1. Then again, here in the middle, I actually see that I have like terms again. They both have an x squared, so I'm going to combine those. I'm going to carry down my 6x to the 4th. And I'm going to carry down my negative 1. And I have a positive 2x squared minus 3x squared. Well, 2 minus 3 is a negative 1. And since the variable is the same, I'm going to carry that to my answer. And I get 6x to the 4th minus x squared minus 1. And this is completely simplified. And then I'm going to show you one other really, really super hard example. A binomial times a trinomial. And this is example 5. I have x minus 1 times the trinomial 3x squared minus 2x plus 1. Okay? And I purposely chose simple numbers so it's not too complicated. I'm going to split it just like we did up here. I'm going to take this binomial and split it into two things. I have x times something and negative 1 times something. In those parentheses, I'm going to copy down this entire trinomial, 3x squared minus 2x plus 1, 3x squared minus 2x plus 1. And now all I'm doing is distributing. I have x times 3x squared. Well, there's a 1 in front of this x, so that's 1 times 3, which is 3. X times x squared is x cubed. Then I have x times negative 2x, and again 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. X times x is x squared. Then I have that x times a positive 1, and 1 times anything is itself, so that's a positive x. You can put the 1 in front if you need to, but you don't have to. Then I have a negative 1 times 3x squared, so I have negative 3x squared. Negative 1 times negative 2x, so I have a positive 2x. And then I have negative 1 times a positive 1, and that's going to give me a negative 1. Now this time when I go to combine like terms, I notice that I have a couple different sets of like terms. I have negative 2x squared and a negative 3x squared. And then I have a positive x here and a positive 2x here. So I'm going to combine those two different sets of like terms. I'm going to carry down the 3x cubed, and I'm going to carry down that negative 1. Those haven't changed. But then I have negative 2x squared minus 3x squared. Well, negative 2 minus 3 is a negative 5, and I'm going to carry down the x squared. Then I have a positive x plus 2x. Remember, there's like a 1 here. So that's 1 plus 2, which is 3x. And this is the final answer because it's completely simplified. Now, we are going to spend some more time doing binomial times binomial, like example 3 and 4. But I wanted you to get a good view of the entire picture. Please make sure that you put this on the next page of your notebook. The title is Binomial Multiplication. Okay? And we'll talk about this more in class next week.